Okay, tonight we return to where Royal Caribbean got its start, with Miami. We're also where I got my start with Royal Caribbean, on the Empress of the Seas, and we take a look at the unique dining room she offers on board. It's all coming up, so let's set sail. Welcome to day one of the cruise view sailing from onboard the Empress of the Seas. Today was October 10th, 2019, and first day on board, sailing what is a bit of a different ship from past series. Past, we've sailed many large ships, Oasis class, Quantum class, touched on the Vision and the Radiance class with a sailing upon each, but with the Empress of the Seas, we are on the smallest ship in the fleet, and of course, that means the smallest in the series as well. So of course, that means we have a couple top stories today, starting with Empress of the Seas. This is the second time I've sailed on her. It's actually turned to the first ship I ever sailed with Royal Caribbean. Back in June of 2002, I sailed on the then Nordic Empress on a 7-night itinerary out of Manhattan to Bermuda, back when she could do the routes that brought her to all three of the main ports rather than staying in dockyard as the current ships tend to do. So touching a bit on history back then, of course she was not the Empress of the Seas, she was the Nordic Empress. Setting sail on June 25th, 1990, she was christened the Nordic Empress. Coming from the merger of Admiral Cruises into Royal Caribbean, she was of course a ship designed and ordered by Admiral Cruises to join their fleet. Following the merger, she was given a few modifications, of course, a new name, and joined the Royal Caribbean fleet, which makes her one of the few Royal Caribbean ships that ever sailed, and of course the only one that currently sails that was not specifically designed to meet the Royal Caribbean standards or adhere to the design elements that are found in traditional Royal Caribbean ships, which means she's a bit different than the other ones. She's a bit unique, a little unusual, and certainly one of the rarer ships in the fleet. At a size of just 48,563 gross tons, she is also by far the smallest ship, compared to even the Vision class at 70,000 gross tons. She is a very small ship for the Royal Caribbean fleet, but also for any of the major cruise lines. She is one of the smaller of the major line ships. She's just 692 feet long and about 100 feet wide, which is less than half the width of an Oasis class ship, to really put that perspective on there. She of course was the Nordic Empress, but that did not last forever. She was renamed in 2004 to the Empress of the Seas, joining the signature of the seas naming that's found on all the other Royal Caribbean ships in the fleet. And that lasted about 4 years, when in March of 2008 she left the Royal Caribbean fleet for the sub-brand of Pull&Tier at the time. Spent several years sailing for Pull&Tier under the name Empress, before in 2016 making a return to the Royal Caribbean fleet, something that has never happened with a Royal Caribbean ship before, that it has left the fleet and rejoined. So that is truly a rarity and something unique about the Empress of the Seas, that she not only sailed for Royal Caribbean once, but twice. And in that second time, she was delayed a bit, originally expected to join in March, did not set sail until May, as they found a few more modifications had to be done, as she received a large overhaul and refit to the entire ship to get her up to that Royal Caribbean standard once again. So while that was unusual, the main reason they brought her back, of course, was Cuba. Cuba, the big place that everyone wanted to go, a hotspot for decades that was always forbidden, became available, and of course you needed a small ship to get there, and the quickest way to do that is to bring a ship that already exists, and that is where the Empress of the Seas came in, and how she ended up back in the Royal Caribbean fleet. So she of course joined to sail Cuba and sailed for a little over a year before Cuba was ultimately removed from the availability of U.S. ships to sail to once again. And that meant she was back in the Royal Caribbean fleet with nowhere to truly sail to, and those 6-month itinerary windows suddenly had to be switched up once again. So she's currently sailing a variety of itineraries to the Caribbean and Bahamas, typically about 4 to 7 days, a couple that go about 8 days, but starting next year in the summer of 2020, she'll make a return to her original location of New York City, running that traditional 7-night route to Bermuda, along with a few itineraries of up to 11 nights to Canada. So she'll be back where she spent many years, about 2 decades ago, and taking on some of those locations she once sailed every week. So this sailing is a 7-night Western Caribbean, but that is not what it was. As I mentioned, Cuba was removed from the Empress's itineraries, and originally this was to sail to Cuba on a Havana, Cienfuegos, and Santiago de Cuba sailing. One of the more unique sailings to Cuba. Most ships tend to, including the Empress, simply visit Havana for a day, possibly an overnight in Havana, along with Key West or Bahamas. For this sailing, it was supposed to be unique in that it would have not just 1 but 3 different stops in Cuba, along with 3 sea days dividing each of those stops up, making it a truly rounded itinerary, 100% focused on Cuba with not a single stop outside the country. Fortunately, with that ban, that meant that all those itineraries changed, and that included this one, with a change to a new itinerary for the sailing of Miami to Key West on day 2, day at sea, followed by Costa Maya, Mexico, Cozumel, Mexico, a second day at sea headed back towards Florida to make a stop at Coco Cay in the Bahamas before returning to Miami. And along with that, when the Cuban itinerary was dropped from rotation and no longer allowed to be continued, World Caribbean, of course, did make offers to the guests that were already booked. You could either cancel it, no penalty, transfer it, and receive an onboard credit for another sailing, or you could stick to the current itinerary and get a 50% discount on whatever your booking price was. So that, of course, was the option that I chose for this sailing, to take that discount and hold on to the dates that we had. While she's not sailing to Cuba this sailing, the signs of it are all over the ship though. From the largest lounge on the ship, Boleros, which is commonly a more subdued, smaller venue on board the other ships, that is the largest lounge on the ship and used for all of the shows outside the Royal Theater. And that features a full-on Cuba style. Cuban pictures, tiling, everything about that venue looks like Cuba, including the inclusion of cafe in Boleros with a full Cuban style, including authentic Cuban coffees and other Cuban accents to that area to truly give that feel that was supposed to add to the enrichment experience of sailing to Cuba on board. In addition to the elements that you find throughout the ship that give that reflection of Cuba, there's also something I found in the logo shop today, and that is an entire rack of clearance shirts from the original sailings to Cuba. So while we can't get to Cuba, you can still buy your Royal Caribbean Cuba shirts as well as Empress of the Seas Cuba shirts for those old sailings that were to be and are no more. So the Empress of the Seas is the oldest ship we've ever sailed on with the theCruiseView. First one I sailed on, and she was built back in 1990, long before the Oasis ever set sail in 2009. And while the rest of the fleet has received revitalizations, the Empress has gone into dry dock since her return and received a major refit before returning to the fleet, but she did not receive the technology of the rest of the fleet. She is still very much sailing pre-2009, pre-Oasis class in terms of her technology. There's no app, no Royal IQ, no Royal app. There's no interactive touchscreens around the ship. The styles and technology on board are really as they were in the 90s. The cards still slide into a slot, no tapping. Photos are lining the walls of the focus photo gallery. There's no room numbers, no cards handed when you get your photo taken. You look for your picture on the wall just like you used to. The menus are posted on the wall outside the dining room every night to check for the next day. Not on the TV, not on your phone, nowhere else. And of course, since there is no app, there is Wi-Fi on board, but connecting to it immediately gives you the login for the VOOM internet, and there is no backdoor to iMessages or any other communication ability on board the ship. So it really is an old school sailing experience like we used to have 10 plus years ago on board. But the one nice thing we have, while it is a low-tech ship, we do have a new compass style again. We've seen a couple different iterations. We saw the music move to the bottom of the compass listings, and that really helped break things up. This compass is by far the best compass I've seen Royal Caribbean offer on a ship. It breaks everything out into different sections. You have an entire section just for your entertainment. So when you're looking at the compass and you're scanning through it, trying to figure out what you're going to do tonight, instead you can look straight at the entertainment section and figure out what's going on. All the items that used to clutter the compass, such as the spa and treatments that were out there, had their own section for spa and retail therapy. There's a section for things to do, good to know, for foodies, music and dancing. Everything is divided by section, and within each section it is in the time order. So it makes it really easy to find out what's going on right now, what you want to go check out, and more importantly, skip past all the clutter that tends to fill the compass and focus purely on what you truly care about. And so this was day one of this sailing. As I mentioned, we started out in Miami today. We had a 4 p.m. scheduled departure this evening, and right at 4 p.m. we dropped those lines, got ready to prepare. By 4:08 we were moving away from the pier, starting our way out to sea, and directly in front of us it was a Royal Caribbean ship spotting day because we were looking straight at the Vision of the Seas, who was there from 6 a.m. to 4 p.m. getting ready to depart just after us, but not until we were sailing past her and had a nice little horn battle going. We then immediately after the Vision passed Mein Schiff 1, another Royal Caribbean subsidiary with 2 cruises, and a ship that shares a lot of common design elements and appearances of what we've seen on the Solstice and Quantum class ships. She is making a rare visit for a port of call day rather than a turnaround day in Miami, and just last week was up in Cape Liberty as well. After passing her, we then headed towards the coast, passed through the channel by South Beach and off to the ocean. At about 4:40 we made it to the ocean, and looking back we could see the Vision of the Seas following behind us. And all night we've seen the Vision of the Seas sailing behind us. As after the sunset we then did see her pass by, and we can now see her slightly ahead of us at this point. For the weather today, we had a sunset tonight at 6:59 p.m. just after dinner time, long after we departed, so we didn't get that sunset over the Miami skyline at all or over the coast, but we saw that over the ocean, and it was beautiful, and could not see the actual sun go down again, just like on the Ovation of the Seas last sailing. There were too many clouds, too much cloud cover and rain around to try to see the sun, but you could certainly see a lot of that color in the sky and reflective off the water. So still a nice sight to see. Today we had very sunny conditions. It was incredibly hot out there. We had a high of 84 degrees, but it felt much warmer. But we also had some stray showers, especially in the late afternoon. You could see those showers down the coast a bit. You could see the storms really start to move in just before departure. When we're up on the top deck, it just got very dark over the city of Miami and was moving towards us. Right when we started to move, it started to drizzle, but we got out of the way ahead of it and stayed ahead of it as we made our way to the ocean. But shortly after out at sea, we ran right into the storm that we had seen passing north of Miami earlier, and that cleared the whole top deck. It was a heavy storm that really hit in an instant. But beyond that, it's been a decent night. We passed through that storm, conditions got nice again. Seas have been smooth. She is a small ship, you feel everything. In fact, when I sailed her back in 2002, this is the only ship that ever made me feel a bit sick. But so far, you don't even feel her moving. She's a small ship, but those seas are fairly calm out there, and it's like she's not even moving at this point. And we have very calm winds listed in the compass, about 6 knots. Before we moved, it was so hot, really didn't feel like there was any wind going on, but the compass does say 6. So today was the first day on board, but for me, I actually arrived in Miami on Tuesday night, got a late flight in, arrived about 11 p.m., spent my first night at a hotel near the airport to take advantage of the airport shuttles before getting a taxi to head over to South Beach for a different hotel on Wednesday. Spent Wednesday exploring the South Beach area, looking at all the activity that goes on in that area, especially at night with all the different neon lighting that goes on along that road. And during the day, spent the time walking the beach, heading all the way up to the inlet to take a look around there. There were no ships in before today while I was here, but still took a chance to head up there to look. And today, we then made our way to the ship, took another taxi. We actually didn't take the tunnel this time. We headed into Miami a little bit deeper and took the bridge that you used to always take to enter. And there was no traffic. Barely any cars around, and certainly never stopped for any traffic. Made it across the bridge. Around the island, there was no traffic even at the other terminals you could pass right by. And there were 3 ships in port, but only 2 turnarounds, and those were smaller ships. So it was very easy to make it to the ship. We were docked at Terminal G for the Empress of the Seas, with the Vision of Seas right next door at Terminal F, and the 2 ship a little bit farther down. When we got to the terminal, no traffic there as well. Very easy to park, unload, get all our stuff together, no chaos, nothing crazy going on, no pushing, shoving. Very calm, orderly process. It was empty the entire way through. Got into the terminal, very short lines, barely took any time to get through anything. It was about 15-20 minutes from the moment we pulled up till we were on board the ship. It was an incredibly quick and efficient process, and I don't know how much of the calmness of it was the fact that it was not a lot of people on board this ship, or the fact that there's not a lot of people in the whole port, because of course not having a lot of people in the port kept the chaos down as a whole throughout the Port of Miami, and especially to get through Terminal G on board to the Empress of the Seas. So for today's cruise compass, looking at what happened once I stepped on board this ship. Of course, first thing I did was check the dining room. Usually we get a perfect table. This time we had to put a request in for a different one. We were able to get that taken care of very quickly. Had a note on our door probably about an hour and a half later already with a new table assignment for that. So that was very quickly expedited to take care of, and probably because we went there rather quickly and gave them plenty of time to try and find another arrangement, we're toward the top of that list of requests, making it much easier to ensure it would happen. After that, we headed up to the Windjammer for lunch. We got to the pier 11:30, got on the ship about 11:45, 11:50, and got up to the Windjammer about 12:15. It was incredibly crowded. The Windjammer on board the ship seemed very small and chaotic at the time. Of course, it's always crazy on the first day of a cruise. Been trying to avoid that lately, but there are not a whole lot of dining venues on board the Empress of the Seas, so we had to go up to the Windjammer. Very small venue, not a lot of seats, but there is some outdoor seating people took advantage of right at the pool deck. And the buffet line, unlike other ships, doesn't really repeat. There's some items that repeat from the port and starboard side, but you really have to look at the entire buffet to find what you want. It is a small area, especially when there are so many people around and all that luggage involved today. After that, we headed to check out the room. Normally they open at 1 o'clock. On here, they were available at 1:30, and not sure if that delay caused it, but in all the sailings I've been on, typically you see 1 or 2 people waiting at the door to get into their cabin. Today, it was packed. Standing in the centrum, waiting to get to our cabin. On every deck, there were tons of people just filling the entire area, waiting to get into their cabin. I've never seen so many people so eager to get into their cabin, and the moment those doors opened, it was like a stampede of people looking to get to their cabin as quickly as possible. And that was 1:30. slightly later than other ships, and the rooms were ready. There weren't really any people out in the hallways trying to do some last minute cleanup. It seemed like everything was pretty well in order at that point. But there was no luggage in the hallways yet. That came a bit later, so with no luggage, we took a look at the room. Very small rooms on board the ship. We have cabin 8500, which, like we had in the Ovation of the Seas, faces forward, gives you that view out of where we're headed rather than where we've been. And we then took a look around the ship to see more of where we're headed as we headed up to the top deck, to the pool deck area, to look around the ship, see what the rest of the port had going on. From there you could see that directly across the island over at the Royal Caribbean headquarters, construction is already underway with some ground clearing for the future Royal Caribbean headquarter expansion. A lot of new stuff coming from them, from a new parking garage to an entirely new headquarter building being added onto the existing site. In addition to that work being done, the Port of Miami as a whole is a huge construction site with brand new Norwegian terminal being built that we saw as we're departing, along with some other terminals starting some renovation work. And of course, the Norwegian terminal follows the brand new Royal Caribbean terminal, and following it will then be a new MSC terminal, new terminal for Carnival, and of course, a new terminal for Virgin Voyages coming. So a lot of new work being done on the Port of Miami at this point. After that, our muster drill was at 3:30 today, and this one followed, as everything else has, a very traditional way of doing it. The life jackets are in the cabins as they used to be, and on the signs on the back of the doors they tell you to bring the life jacket with you to your muster station if you are in the cabin. If you're not, you are supposed to go straight to your muster station and they have them there for you. But if you're in the cabin, they are in your cabin to be brought. At about 3:15, the crew started cycling through all the decks on the ship, directing people to their muster stations. In the old days, you would hear the alarm go off, and at that point, everybody would run to their station. Nowadays, most people are there by the time the alarm goes off, but this is the first time I've seen them actually going through and sending everyone to their station before the actual scheduled time. And by about 3:25, 5 minutes before the actual muster drill, most of the decks were empty. Everybody was already at their station waiting. And when we got to our station, it was, unlike the past ones where it was always in that theater as we've been in the front of the ship, this one was outside on the lifeboat deck. It's a bit hot. Sun was shining in there, but they tried to keep everybody in the shaded area. And being outside meant there was no video. You were supposed to watch that video on the TVs in your cabin before you headed there, because they didn't provide any of that additional information about how things work. The crew in charge of each station did give a little bit of an overview talk on that, and once again reiterated that you should watch the video in your cabin before leaving things for the bridge to make a ship-wide announcement going through all the safety details, such as how a life jacket works and what you should do in case of emergency. And then the captain came on board to give a final message to everybody before releasing them after only about a 10-minute drill this time. So that took us to about 3:40, then headed up to the top deck to get ready for that 4 p.m. departure. That took us about 40 minutes before that rain came and we had to head back inside the ship. So that was perfect time to head back to the cabin where the luggage was finally available. Got everything unloaded just in time for 5:30 dinner tonight. So for dinner, we were in the main dining room on deck 4, and we had a menu that featured a couple different items we've had in the past. Started out with that very traditional French onion soup. Always say it, it's a great way to compare ships. And this one was delicious. The cheese was all over it. It was an incredibly thick cheese. It was a little bit more raw than what some of the cheeses on other ships. It was not overly crispy cheese as we've seen on some of the other French onion soups, but it was certainly a much thicker layer of cheese than I've seen on any of the other ships up to this point. For my entree, I then went with the baked polenta and feta cheese. That's one I've had on many ships, and this one was one of the better ones. They had slightly smaller feta cubes than we saw on the Ovation of the Seas, and of course those vegetables as well with it. So that was a good dish, and to follow it up, I then went with another one I've had on many ships that has varied from each ship, and that was the no sugar added pear blueberry cobbler. Had this several times, and it's been different almost every time, and once again today was a different one. When we had it on the Ovation, it had a little more of that jello look to it, and today's was pretty much the exact opposite. Instead of a shallow, large plate that was filled with the cobbler, it was a very tall, small bowl, almost like dish that was used for it. And it was very wet, a lot of gooey juice in it rather than that very dried form that we've seen on a couple ships lately. So this was once again a very different iteration of the dish than we've been seeing. So that was 5:30. It was a rather quick service, gave time to go out to look at that sunset by 7 o'clock, spend time looking around the ship a little bit before 8:15 when we headed to the Royal Theater for the Welcome Aboard show. So the Welcome Aboard show, of course, featured the Royal Caribbean singers and dancers, giving a little preview of what they have to come, along with the cruise director, Elvis Pinto, giving an introduction to everybody, telling a few jokes, getting to know the crowd a bit more. And then that was followed by a comedian, the first comedian of the sailing, somebody we just met not long ago, as Mike Pace, who was on board the Ovation Seas for our sailing there, has made his way to the Empress of the Seas. Big ship, new sailing to Alaska, all the way down to the small ship. And ironically, while his routine was very similar to the one that we saw on the Ovation Seas, there was probably about 2/3 of the content that was the same. There was some things different, and a good portion of what was different was the fact that there was an entire section of his routine about the fact that he had just come off of the Alaskan season and had been doing all these sailings on board the ships in Alaska, the Ovation of the Seas, and some of the jokes that he had written about what he had seen and experienced up there. After that went till 9 o'clock, and they had perfect flow going on in the ship. As you stepped out the Royal Theater into the Centrum, you were immediately into If You Know It, Sing It. Hosted by Andy with the cruise director staff, took place right in the middle of the Centrum. Centrum is very small on this ship compared to the Grandeur, and it has a nice flow between the two decks, so it took place in the middle of the Centrum, which is kind of elevated in between those levels, really allowing it to flow between them, and he did an incredible job with this. It really did not get a very good level of crowd participation in it, but he added a ton of his own style and comedy to it, brought in people from the crowd, ran around the whole Centrum trying to get people interacting, and really added a whole level of comedy to this show. And while that was not packed, it did have a decent crowd, mainly because of the people exiting the Royal Theater. It was also scheduled very oddly against adult karaoke, which also took place at the exact same time over in Baleares. So once this ended, I then headed over to Baleares to catch the end of the adult karaoke, which had a small but decent crowd to it. Following that, though, was the main reason I headed to Baleares, and that was for the Who Wants to Be a Caribbeanaire game show. Once again, hosted by Andy, it had all the comedy and humor that he brought to the previous game, and it pretty much was one long comedy routine. There was not a whole lot of true game show or seriousness to it. The entire thing was one big comedy act, and it almost could have been scripted with just how funny and natural the whole thing went down. But that was 10:15, last about 30 minutes till 10:45, a little bit later than that. But it had a very tiny crowd by the time it was done. There weren't a lot of people that seemed to stay up until 10:45 to see the end of that. Walking around the ship, it was pretty empty at that point. But at 10:45, it was also in the Royal Theater, a special late night movie with The Hustle. So I checked that out. That was a 90-minute movie, so it started 10:45, ended at about 12:15, and it's interesting as well, the ship's been empty. That game was fairly empty. The movie actually had a pretty decent crowd for a movie, especially an evening movie, and one that late. It had a much larger crowd than the actual game show had, which is kind of interesting. Definitely seems like a portion of the crowd on board is very active and humorous and having fun. Another portion is very laid back and quiet, and that's creating a bit of an interesting dynamic on board the ship tonight. So that movie ended about 12:15, pretty much wrapped up the night. Not a whole lot going on after that. You've got, of course, the DJ up in the Viking Crown Lounge, but beyond that, all the venues have gone silent for the evening. So this is the first day of the cruise on board the Empress of the Seas. We're going to have a few interviews on board this sailing, but tonight we do not have an interview. We do have a daily dine / venue though. Each night I'm going to focus on one venue or dining venue, because while the Empress of the Seas doesn't really have new venues or different venues that we haven't seen before, she does have a lot of venues and areas that are different than the other ships. Because this ship was designed and built for Admiral cruises originally and converted to Royal Caribbean before delivery, she of course has a few differences and unique elements that you don't see on any other ship in the Royal Caribbean fleet, and that is why tonight we're going to look at one of those unique venues with the Starlight Dining Room. The main dining room of a cruise ship can take on many forms depending on the line. With Royal Caribbean, it has long been about grand open spaces with large multi-level rooms. These often feature an elaborate art piece or staircase on a focal wall that separates the dining room from the kitchen. With the Empress of the Seas, the large open space remains like the rest of the fleet, but gone is the wall dividing it from the kitchen. Instead, the entrance is on the starboard side of the ship, walking past the kitchen area. This allows the dining room to stretch all the way to the back of the ship, where massive windows allow the sun to shine in and guests to look out upon the ship's wake as she sails from location to location. The larger lower level on Deck 4 is where guests with traditional early or late dining are assigned. This level features a variety of table sizes, including some for two, all the way up to the largest group tables, with the captain's table featured in the center. A staircase connects the two levels with a platform area where musicians can play and announcements can be made from. The second level on Deck 5 is U-shaped, looking down upon the main level and out the large aft windows. This level is where guests with My Time dining can make reservations and come to eat. In addition to dinner, Deck 4 of the main dining room is used to serve one additional meal each day. On port days, a traditional sit-down breakfast is offered, while on sea days, instead of offering breakfast and lunch like the rest of the fleet, Empress instead serves a special brunch. This unique offering on board the Empress of the Seas features a large buffet setup as well as made-to-order stations and offerings that blend breakfast and lunch together, as well as the very popular large salad area that people have come to expect from a dining room lunch. In addition to the food, guests can also partake in complimentary mimosas. So that is a beautiful, unique venue with those massive windows looking at the back, something completely different than any of the other ships in the fleet. You really don't have another dining room with a view of that. Some of them have a lot of windows to them. They all have the big opening in the middle, but those windows are truly something different that the Empress of the Seas has. So that about does it for today's episode. This is day one. We left Miami. We are on the way south, hugging the coast of Florida, because tomorrow morning we'll be up bright and early for an arrival to our first port of call in Key West, Florida. That'll be my first time ever in Key West. A lot of new first ports on this one, even though it wasn't supposed to be this itinerary. We do still have Key West, which is new, Costa Maya, which is new, and then Cozumel we did. But Perfect Day at Cuba Cay is also a new one, since we of course missed it due to the weather when we were on the Quantum of the Seas. So a lot of new protocols, with the very first of those being Key West tomorrow. So be sure to come back, check that episode out. Thanks for watching. I'm Picone. Stay tuned for the links.